5 months ago, I asked the Prime Minister to acknowledge that the carbon tax was at the root of food inflation in Canada. The response I received was irrelevant. Well, I'll try and address inflation, its causes, and the government's complicity in raising prices for Canadians again, and we'll see if anyone is prepared to acknowledge and respond, given they've had some time to brush up on the economic challenges that inflation has caused in our economy and in our society. Food. In Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it ranks as the base physiological level, long before any self-actualization, long before any need or desire to a government who constantly looks for ways of expanding government spending. Canadians see that spending and resultant tax grab as being an overreach and out of control. Inflation is measured in Canada by Statistics Canada, a government agency that gives an approximation of how Canadians experience inflationary effects, and it reports it as the Consumer Price Index, or CPI. In 2023, CPI was measured at 3.9%. In March 2024, that measure had fallen to 2.9%, the way they measure it. April's CPI number will be available on May 21st. What April's number will show is the 23% increase in carbon tax that was implemented on April 1st, a tax on food, fuel, home heating, and everything else. So let me help predict that there will be a hiccup in our supposed decline in inflation, and the Bank of Canada will take its cue from this report for its June decision on interest rates. An inflation uptick will reinforce a decision to not drop interest rates, thus keeping rates high for mortgage holders primarily. Real estate inflation is the worst effect of this government's failed fiscal policies. The Bank of Canada governor has repeatedly spoken about how this government's policies are causing inflation, while the government is taking no lessons, as they always say. The government has openly predicted last year that the carbon tax added 0.15 points to the interest rate. So inflation may have been 3.7% to 3.8% without the carbon tax increase last year. Inflation is the rate of increase. So last year's increase is baked in to a new higher base of costs for food, fuel, home heating, and everything else. Imagine what would happen to the base effect when this ineffective tax on everything is removed. Canadians will get real pricing relief immediately. Food price inflation peaked at the beginning of last year, close to 12%. Think about that. It's down now to about 2%, but let's acknowledge the base effect of the increased cost adds significantly to continued increases in food costs across Canada. If the government wants to pay attention to the effects of food inflation that it is causing, I would ask them to pay attention to the increasing rise in the use of food banks. Last year, food bank use rose to over 2 million monthly visitors, up 32% year on year. This year, that increase is expected to be an additional 18%. It's time this government started paying attention to the harm they're causing, and that harm is very evident in food inflation. This carbon tax needs to be repealed.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's good to see my friend from Calgary Centre. I enjoyed working with him in the NV Committee on the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, where we agreed on many, many things. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, on this particular matter, I disagree strongly, and I think the evidence supports what I'm about to say. And that is, Mr. Speaker, carbon pricing is not increasing food prices significantly. As of December, the grand total impact of carbon pricing on food prices for Canadians, according to independent researcher, was less than 0.5%, Mr. Speaker. It goes without saying that all of us are very concerned about the increases in food bank usage and the increased cost of living being felt by families. And our government is taking this action, taking this very seriously and taking action to address it. But fear-mongering about carbon pricing does nothing to address this issue, Mr. Speaker. And of course, it carefully avoids mentioning the reality that because of the Canadian carbon rebate, 8 out of 10 households receive more money back through the CCR than they pay towards the fuel charge. Because these are average amounts, lower and middle income households are particularly better off. Second, most emissions from farming are already exempt from the federal fuel charge, 97% in fact. Biological emissions from crop and livestock production are not subject to pollution pricing. Exemptions are provided for gasoline and diesel used in eligible farming machinery, and commercial greenhouse operators are eligible to receive 80% relief from the fuel charge on natural gas and propane. I would also add that the Government of Canada has also implemented a refundable tax credit to return a portion of fuel charge proceeds directly to farm businesses operating in jurisdiction where the fuel charge applies. The Canada Carbon Rebate is also available to eligible individuals and their families to help offset the cost of federal pollution pricing, with residents of small and rural communities, including farmers and their families, able to receive a supplement of 20% of the baseline amount. And of course, our government has committed more than $1.5 billion to support farmers with adopting new practices and technologies that can reduce emissions and improve farm performance. For example, almost $170.2 million has been committed across 415 projects announced to date under the Agricultural Clean Technology Program to support the development and adoption of clean technologies that can reduce emissions and help farmers adapt to climate change, including more than $50 million which is set aside for farmers to put towards the purchase of more efficient grain dryers. Mr. Speaker, pricing pollution is not affecting food prices significantly. It's not hurting our farmers, who know more than many about the importance of taking action on climate change. Using misinformation and scare tactics is irresponsible when many Canadians are struggling right now. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Calgary Centre.
Well, that was an oxymoron in many respects. Fear because Canadians are suffering. We're actually talking about the issues facing Canadians, particularly the cost of living increases that this government is imposing upon them with consistent tax increases. Their whole time in office has been tax increase after tax increase after tax increase. Particularly in this case we've talked about tonight, the carbon tax increase. Now, my colleague across the way spoke about all the agricultural rebates that were available for the carbon tax, but he didn't speak about Bill C-234. And that's one that his government has held up intentionally from getting passed in this House of Commons. It's one of the ways you could help farmers that actually would benefit from a rebate on the carbon tax, but he ignores all that and pretends that they're actually doing something for the farmers in this respect. I disagree. And you take a look at the facts that we presented here. This is very factual. This is very clear that Canadians are actually suffering. Not fear to indicate that Canadians are actually going to food banks. To not say it might be burying your head in the sand. We are actually saying, yes, Canadians are going to food banks at a record level. And that's something this government has to address and has to consider in its response to how the carbon tax and why it shouldn't be repealed. Thank you.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, by taking the lead on climate action, Canada can become a leader on many of the new technologies the world will need to adopt on a massive scale to fight climate change, unlocking economic growth and important trade opportunities. We are seeing these opportunities already. For example, the announcement last summer of a new $1.5 billion battery component plant in Ontario that will create hundreds of jobs. New, cleaner sources of energy we have developed and are putting in place have many other benefits, such as reducing other types of air pollution from burning fossil fuels that cause asthma and damage ecosystems. I want to thank the honourable member for the question, and Mr. Speaker, I hope you have a great evening.
Have a good evening, everyone.